Namaste. I hope you're doing very well. This is an essay I've been working on for the past month, sort of like the other one that I just published yesterday. This is slightly different. It's a different piece, obviously. This is called How Orgasming Thought Energy from Naropa University revived the Sapiosexual Erotophile within me. And here we go. Part 1, Authenticity. What must it be like to tell the people you're closest to that you're a porn star and that your greatest interest in life is eroticizing sexuality? On the one hand, I shiver in fear of the relationships that may turn more distant. Although the sexual revolution has liberated cosmopolitan culture significantly as a topic, at least for me, there's an intuitive conviction to bring it up with supreme discretion. Know your environment and know your audience. On FetLife and Adult Friend Finder, I don't need to censor myself. On Instagram, maybe a little, but not entirely. On Facebook, well, perhaps it reveals my own insecurity and lack of self-love. But I think, to quote Anthony Kiedis from the new Red Hot Chili Peppers song, Black Summer, crack the flaming whip, a sailing on a censorship, riding on a headless horse to make the trip. In any event, context is everything, as they say. On the other hand, fear of discussing sexuality openly in an intellectual and constructive way, I mean, all talk, as much as possible, should be constructive. That's not healthy. And with respect to the fear, would you be afraid because you're insecure and lacking in self-love, such as how I felt reading my sexual openness on Facebook, where the closest friends and family lurk? Though, let us not assume they're sharks and that they bite. Or because you feel like it's a genuine threat to your survival. In certain workplace settings, perhaps, if you pontificate about a thought on sex, you will get fired. Like you might get fired if you express a political view that doesn't align with the ethos of upper management, whether upper management is one employer or a corporate bureaucracy. That I think so much and so sensitively about this leads me to wonder why, and just how in love am I? Just how in love am I with love and sex? I don't want to exaggerate or downplay things that are sometimes far too easy for me to do. So I'm feeling most Socratic and essayistic as I wonder about this. So thank the 0-point field, imagination, space, and thought for Socrates and philosophy and Michel de Montaigne and the essay, and Susan Sontag for coining the term erotics, and Naropa University. clearly, love and sex matter so strongly to me that I risked losing my 14-year-long monogamous relationship with X to explore non-monogamy and polyamory. Was it worth it? Fuck yes, as the expression goes. Every penny of it, as another expression goes. The loss of intimacy and romance with someone who you feel just doesn't hear you, that's a major plus. It turns out that what hurts the most is, I'm gonna quote Bob Dylan here from his song Idiot Wind. We're idiots, babe. It's a wonder we can even feed ourselves. And while I'm at it, Chad Kroeger from the Nickelback song Mistake. What a mistake. I have a fear of incompetence and jarring others with incompetence. So I remind myself things like 3.98 GPA, going to grad school at Naropa University, doing yoga and meditation and saying affirmations almost twice a day, every day. I masturbate sometimes tantrically. I'm a feminist. I'm sex positive and support female produced intentionally ethical porn. I seek alliances with those less privileged than myself. I want to love and be loved. I try to be the best friend I can be. I'm political and vocally so. I ran for office, political office against a corrupt mayor, and looked her in the eyes telling her I disagreed with how she went about being mayor. I called my senators and congresswoman insisting that President Trump be impeached and removed from office. Goodness, I'm not trying to be vain, but I'm working mad hard on my self-talk and talking to myself with self-love. What about my love of sex and love? Do I love the erotic as much as optimizing mind over matter energy via thoughts and essays? No, I love it more. Because as an erotophile, my efforts are directed towards the eroticization of mind over matter energy via thoughts, and thus feelings, actions, etc. Optimism is no longer explicit enough for me as a concept and word, as it does not directly point to the symbolic power of loving and spiritual sex. However, am I biased in placing more emphasis on sexual desire because as of this writing, I've not been having any sex for almost a month, and because I crave it immensely, with gratitude for the opportunity to appreciate how absence makes my heart grow fonder? I raise these questions because I have found myself growing increasingly fascinated with the erotic, and less ashamed of it. As if my loneliness and sexual frustration have been alchemizing into essays on the erotic, and I believe I owe it to my experience at Naropa University and the time I've spent reflecting on and writing about my thoughts and feelings around that experience. Perhaps I owe it even more to the super courageous transgender poets who spoke so openly and unabashedly about their sexual thoughts and feelings. And maybe this embrace gives me a kind of destigmatizing feeling and a political activist-like feeling without having to wander too deep into the weeds of politics. Or that is to say, I'm passionately for bringing more health to the global dialogues on sexuality, which inevitably have political implications, such as legalizing sex work, prostitution, etc. The questions also arise because I recently had an exchange on Facebook with a Swedish sexologist and told her I envied her, which begs further questioning. Did and or do I really envy her? Because, speaking of politics, I used to think I wanted to be president of the USA. I used to think I wanted to be a poet. I used to think I wanted to be a dog trainer. But shouldn't I have learned from polyamory by now that if I did want to do all of the above, it's all good, because having multiple loves is okay? I mean, no doubt, I seek a primary passion that I remain committed to for life, such that I can feel I've gained an expert-like connection to it. And seems that, as of now, I'm hoping that writing about the erotic will be that primary passion of mine. And if it doesn't, perhaps the change will lead to passions that are ever stronger and all the more constructive. But I really do hope. I pray to the zero ground field. Imagination. Space. That I stick with sex writing, because it makes me feel so much multiversal love, unlike anything else in the multiverse. So much so that I find myself more authentic than I have ever been. Or even that I was never, until around now, quite authentic. Even if I was honest within my glibness. More fully open. Authenticity and honesty. These are all different concepts. You can tell truths, but the truths might be small tips of the icebergs. As for authenticity, you are essentially embracing your nudity without shame and with love. Opening the blinds of your soul, your consciousness, your macro-conscious field of micro-conscious thoughts. I have thought in the past that writing about sex would be a good match in life for me, but I felt so much fear every time. Anyway, how is it that Naropa University inspired me towards these thoughts and feelings? There's a short answer and a longer answer. I'm going to stick with the shorter answer for now because I feel it sufficiently compresses the longer answer, which grants us all more time for other longer answers. A young lady I met at the Naropa University campus, a documentarian, among other things, Lucia Rabisi is her name, during the university's first week of its summer writers program, spoke explicitly of ridding ourselves of despair and trading it in for hope. I thought that was so beautiful. Erotic, even. I eventually asked her if she could elaborate. She spoke of alchemizing anger, In my mind, that lingered only abstractly, as I didn't know how to alchemize my anger. I didn't feel any anger, I thought. It happened to be that synchronicities abounded, as I was also taking a self-love course designed by the Amory podcast creator and co-host Megan Bhatia, who spoke of alchemizing anger. Still, the concept remained ambiguous to me. In time, I moved from thoughts on alchemizing anger to authenticity, as I dug deep within to ask how I could be more honest with myself and with y'all. At the same time, my marriage collapsed. My father, who is both an expert couples counselor, published a book about it even, and a man divorced 3 times, once told me, I can't figure out my marriages. The topic of his marriages is too loaded a conversation for me to go into a tangent about just now, but what I want to say is that I didn't want to feel like him, like I can't figure out my marriage. But it occurred to me that in my 14 years with X, I unwittingly and inadvertently buried and repressed aspects of myself in hope of evading argument and disharmony. I never spoke openly, for example, about my polycuriosity. I didn't speak openly about my embrace of pornography, of the ethical variety. When I felt that my writing didn't resonate with X, I just took it as natural that no one is going to feel resonance with all aspects of someone else. As opposed to taking a hint that the depths of my consciousness, the direction of my thought and feeling energies were seriously misaligned with hers. Instead of accepting our many disagreements, I resisted them, always trying my damnedest to change her mind. I was fucking inauthentic and even masochistic. Fuck. My bad. This also means I wasn't writing what I really thought, felt, believed, and thus wanted. It is more nuanced and complicated than that, however. I think the best way I can explain it is that when I would write, I routinely tried to place my attention exclusively on what I believed I was hoping to think, feel, and believe and experience, but never noting what I was actually thinking, feeling, believing, and experiencing. This is the case to such an extent that I reached a point of complete detachment from the present tense of my consciousness. It was kind of like losing my sense of sight and falling into a stupor. Then, one day, in my weeks of revising a poem I wrote about my time at Naropa University, out of pure interpreted necessity to move my consciousness along and forward, walk on, as Bono puts it, to have an inkling of what I was thinking and feeling. I hypothesized that the best thing I could do was write prosaically and personally. A personal essay, require myself to identify what's up with my consciousness and see if I can process it rationally, as much as one can reason, and add nothing else to the writing. Essentially, talk out loud as authentically as possible. Say anything I feared saying, revise when necessary. And all of a sudden, my consciousness began feeling more and more coherent. I literally felt more grounded, more stable, more into meditation and yoga and tantric sex. I found in my conversations I was even more intelligible, and that suddenly I was talking to more people more often and with more confidence and a straighter back. Better posture and a better posture. Yeah, I'm revising to the last second sometimes. I found myself filling a long, lingering void within myself. Less emptiness. Less of a feeling that something was wrong and or missing, but I just couldn't put my hands on it. This essay began as that poem about Naropa University. I had started drafting it while I was on the bus from the Denver airport to downtown Boulder. I was writing the poem in a state of mind devoted exclusively to what I wanted, not what I was thinking and feeling in relation to what I wanted, and not whether my thoughts were rational. And what is it that I wanted? What was I thinking and feeling in my furthest depths with most intensity? Superficially, I was in awe of Colorado's open space. In New Jersey, spaces feel so crammed, I think, due to it being the most densely populated state in America. But my most intense thought, feeling, one that has been about as lifelong as anything, is that more than anything else, then, or now even, desire to be erotically intimate with a woman I'm attracted to, who is also attracted to me. Inner and outer attraction, soul attraction, who is open to exploring polyamory, sapiosexuality, and tantric sex with me. It had been my hope that I would end up meeting such a woman at Naropa University. Actually, it was X's opinion that I would. "You're gonna get one of those Naropa girls, I can feel it," she said. As it turns out, I was not at all in the right headspace to manifest love and sex during my time at the Naropa University Summer Writers Program. Like I said, if you don't love yourself, you don't know yourself, since you specifically resist aspects of yourself, which is necessarily masochistic, which would necessarily point you more likely in the direction of things that are not aligned with what you really think, feel, and believe, and thus what you really want. Part 2. Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. The taking off of a plane is one of the finest examples of genius that lives inside of people who access it. It is a beautiful projection of physics that rote math and stark prose of observable tendencies that make up our interpretation comes to look like a work of brilliant art. It is proof that in the material world, at least within the context of technology, human beings can fly. It's exhilarating, especially if you don't fly often, to feel yourself as part of an exceptionally intense acceleration and forward ascent into the heights you usually never observe so closely out of a window. The way it briefly tilts and turns and flies upward through the mystical sky, through the pure white seeming clouds that make me feel like I'm soaring through the soul of Antarctica. I love it, though it scares the fuck out of me and makes me feel vulnerable and like I'm sacrificing and surrendering further control of my fate, my destiny, my future, my life, and depending literally on the pilot, co-pilot, plane maintenance, and original engineers. What gives me comfort is material, physics. I can feel the work done by the energies 39,000 feet on top of Earth's grounding ground surface. So I surrendered to my love for physics. The physics and the plane's floor would have to be what grounded me as I tried to manage the anxiety until we would land. As the airplane began its descent to the Denver, Colorado airport, I could feel a most abstract shift in energy. Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore, as Judy Garland said, portraying Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. It was an abundance of New Jersey. It was as if an abundance of New Jersey quanta could not leave my consciousness and body until the plane touched the ground, as if it wasn't real until it was more concrete, as opposed to hidden clouds, so to speak. What was the essence of those New Jersey energies I left in the clouds and no longer felt as I attempted to somehow intuitively take in and feel the novel energies of the Denver airport? I suspect it was in great part the thrill of traveling and the strangeness of traveling alone. I hadn't traveled a long distance alone in 15 years. I had never traveled long distance without X, not since we became a couple. It was such an interesting oscillation of negative and positive. It felt wrong to enjoy the adventure without X. It felt unreal how far away we were from each other. X and I hadn't left the state together for 4 or 5 years when we drove through parts of New England and up ultimately to Portland, Maine. To be in such a different contextual headspace than I had been in for so long. It was refreshing, liberating, exciting, and suspenseful. The mixture of sadness and immense awe persisted as I took the bus from the airport to Boulder and then walked from the bus station to Naropa University. Because Naropa University is an exceptionally Buddhist-inspired university, in my imagination, the energy was explicitly and intensely metaphysical and spiritual. And since it's also very small, both in size and number of students, I felt the conceptual energy of intimacy. Somehow this fundamentally changed me. My life suddenly felt better than almost anything. as I think back on it now and try to verbalize the feeling, many of my best memories arise. For example, I think of when I was 19, a sophomore at Florida Gulf Coast University, and unfortunately I was stoned. It's unfortunate because it would have been so much better if I could have enjoyed it sober and gotten high purely off the bliss of the experience. And I was in the nude outside, dancing and being filmed by a woman. It was as erotic and innocent as a most heartfelt fantasy. It was like Henri Matisse's genius 1905 painting, Bonheur de vivre, Joy of Life. Nude idealists lounging, kissing, dancing, playing music on the beach. That's what's up, as some people say. I actually don't remember much about that day being filmed in the nude, but I remember that I wasn't generally happy or relaxed in those days. And yet, during that brief passage of time, I was so happy that I got out of my head and simply felt one with the universe. That had been my goal in life around that time, as I told a therapist at the college. And present. What a year that had been for my sex life. Earlier that academic year, the autumn of 2005, I was in a room with two girls, and the three of us started masturbating. I was so shy and embarrassed that I couldn't look at them. What if they saw how much I'd have loved to fuck them? I couldn't come either. So even though I didn't exactly seize the moment, well, I mean, come on. I got to masturbate with two girls. That makes me one of the luckiest people in the multiverse. Truly. Zero ground field. Imagination, space, consciousness, thoughts, body of mind. Fucking thank you. I am so intensely grateful for that experience that I could look back on that now and feel just pure goodness. Like the first time I kissed X. Like the breaks I used to take on the beach that was 2 or 3 blocks from the souvenir shop I worked at in South Beach, Miami. And now I recall 2 girls, customers. One was Argentinian, and I didn't believe it because she had blonde hair and blue eyes. She gave me one of the most beautiful smiles anyone ever gave me. And what a polyamorous moment, as I felt guilty that this girl gave me chills and that I fantasized about kissing her. This other woman, she saw me writing in my notebook when it was slow, and she asked if she could read. I showed it to her. She said it reminded her of Nietzsche. I'd heard of Nietzsche and knew he was an important atheist philosopher, but I had never read him. She planted a seed, though, because just a few months later, I did, and then became a huge fan and avid reader of his. Those 2 women made me feel very good about myself. If only I could have made myself feel good about myself then, like I can now. But back to Naropa University. My access to imagination felt more intense than usual, and thus especially fertile for an elevation in thought energy. Perhaps it was the flood of new faces and voices which stimulated it. I came to learn, despite being at times super shy, I love being around people, especially people who felt similar to me. This similarity in of itself was novel. What was the similarity? I can only describe it as Naropa University. It's a tiny, Buddhist-inspired, avant-garde, liberal arts university. It's a private university. Only 854 students. Each of us could have chosen a different university. There's something exceptional about a small group of people that deduced, out of all the colleges on Earth, this small one here in Boulder, Colorado is the university to go to. I felt like I had made a brilliant decision, and that felt so good. So good. Like tantric sex, sexy clothes, meditation, yoga, summer heat, fruit juice, the Dire Straits, the beach. I could feel during those first few hours when we were all outside in front of the Allen Ginsberg Library, reading poetry and prose to each other while musicians played and tried to match the mood of our projecting voices, and listening to each other, clapping, saying great job, eating pizza. This was the pre-orientation reading. Talking, meeting each other. I could feel such a tangible and visceral and radical ethos. A little later that day was orientation. Every single student who was part of the Summer Writers Program was given space to introduce themselves in a heartfelt way. We were asked what we considered our luminous detail. What we considered our luminous detail. This was both fascinating in terms of my own sense of self and experiencing self, while also learning intimate things about others. On a personal level, this was the first time I ever told a room of people that not only that I was polyamorous, but that I was having a challenging time emotionally coping with my wife getting all the action and me getting none. It was also the first time I ever spoke in a directly academic context about my passion for the science, especially the quantum physics of mind over matter and its implications for what we can appreciate is possible in this life. Because I was taking it all in, and because I get easily overstimulated, I'm one of those so-called HSPs, highly sensitive people. I didn't retain enough of what people said. But again, I returned to that sense of energy. I felt like I was in a safe space. Exposure to this kind of atmosphere led me to try and listen more, have a greater appreciation for appreciating each person's complex humanness. As the week went on, my privilege as a transgender, I'm not a trans, my privilege as a cisgender, white, heterosexual male with a middle-class suburban background came to feel more and more blatant, in that there are so many voices from so many different backgrounds that I just didn't know, that I still don't know. Part 3, this is the last part. Eroticism and, to quote the poet Orlando White, poempathy. A week devoted to reading and listening and creative writing can teach a person empathy, for sure. Two sorts of people whose words most impacted me are those who identify as transgender and those who identify as Native people. I asked the poet and creative writing professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts, Orlando White, who read and taught at the Naropa University Summer Writers Program, if he preferred Native American, American Indian, or some other word in reference to his ethnicity. And he told me he prefers Native people. He also informed me that he's Dene, and that Dene is another word for Navajo. Or rather, Dene came to be referred to as the Navajo. I had forgotten the details of the context and found an LA Times article from December 16th, 1993, reporting on the Dene holding public hearings on a proposal to abandon the term Navajo in favor of the name it has always called itself, Dene, which can mean both people of the earth and man. Both the National Park Service and the Indian Health Service say Navajo means piece of large planted fields. The LA Times article says the Navajo has no clear meaning and was bestowed upon the Spanish when they claimed control over the 17 million acres that is now Dene land. The article used the term Navajo. So I can't be confident what Navajo means. Honestly, whenever I get a chance to speak with a Native person, I feel lucky. Because as I shared with Orlando White, so far as my experience is concerned, here in New Jersey, one doesn't tend to encounter or hear much about Native people. The exception is when I was in 4th grade and we had to learn about the Lenni Lenape. In contrast, my academic advisor at Naropa, out there in Colorado, writes at the end of every email, I acknowledge that I live and work upon colonized land within the traditional territories of the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne Nation peoples. Further, I acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. Speaking of expanded consciousness, learning more about the thoughts and feelings and experiences of people who identify as transgender was also interesting. Several years ago, I tutored a trans student over a number of semesters, and he opened up to me about it sometimes, about trans experience and a lot of the psychological hardship that many trans people encounter. My former student shared his psychological hardships, the treatment he received from his parents, the rejection of him being a him, depressed him so much that he told me he often contemplated suicide. Something I mostly forgot about is I do not tend to encounter openly transgender people where I live. The part in New Jersey where I live is one of the slightly more conservative ones. More Trump bumper stickers than I care to see. Though one is too many for me. Not to say there are no trans people here. I don't see people advertising it on my walks or at the stores, is what I'm saying. Though I did, a few months ago, have a transgender student, and I remember getting their pronoun wrong by accident. I felt guilty and embarrassed about that. I was sure to apologize. I made the mistake again and apologized again and said, I need to appreciate your telling me this and your patience with me. The falling back to the pronoun they looked like to me was so unconscious and automatic. I mean that it wasn't intentional, but clearly I wasn't intentional about deeply listening to my student. You live, you learn, as some say. What really heightened my awareness of trans experience, reading Naropa, was the required reading, which was an anthology by all trans authors. We Want It All, an anthology of radical trans poetics. My favorite piece in the anthology was interesting because it touched on both personal identity and the multiversal. Moreover, It has played a significant role in the recent change in my poetics and my sense of purpose, which are perhaps the same, one and the same, to write about the erotic experience, to eroticize my thoughts in essayistic form. This special writing is called Correspondence on Erotics and Karaoke Rooms, and takes the form of 2 epistles. One thing I love, among many other things, about these 2 epistles is that, but for being aware of the book's theme, one wouldn't read explicitly about the writer's transness. The only instance of implication in the text is that one of the writers, Joe, reflects on Susan Sontag's thoughts re homosexuality, and that it is narcissism. And that for Joe, this actually rings true, suggesting that Joe identifies as a gay male. However, for Clara, it is more ambiguous. Clara is conventionally a female name, but if Joe identifies as a gay man and is in a romantic connection with Clara, supposing the intent of the name Clara is to be female or feminine, what does Clara ultimately identify as? Clara never tells. And I like how it demonstrates the way trans experience is a human experience, just like all experiences are for all people. But the more specific trans experience within the broader human experience doesn't have to revolve exclusively around this one aspect of personality. This renders the piece a very holistic one. Also, it allows us to imagine, what if Clara's identity is actually ambiguous? Indeed, curious as I am, I Googled Clara and found that Clara has photography on a website called Cargo Collective, and on Clara's page, Clara explicitly says, regender, I do not wish to provide this information. To be honest, if I have ever consciously been at all, I'm so rarely exposed to people who consciously and explicitly don't identify as a gender, that as I wondered about Clara's gender, I never initially considered that perhaps this was the inference to be drawn. I kept wondering what I was missing that made it clear Clara was male or female. Again, speaking of expanded consciousness, things I don't generally tend to contemplate of my own accord, which are brought to my attention, which present to me complexities of human experience and identity, and how there's always more to a person than we can imagine. The imagination itself, if we suppose it is a fundamental form of energy, may be limitless. And we can't even put a limit on what humans could potentially imagine. But our access to imagination will naturally, probably, always be more finite than the imagination is as a thing of itself, unknown, mysterious, expansive. Though, isn't it interesting that such is the case of all things ultimately? We are all ultimately mysteries to each other, and we inspire each other to imagine what we could learn about someone if we got the privilege to explore deeper intimacy with them. We learn about each other only to wonder more and imagine more. In the words of Bob Dylan, last night I knew ya, tonight I don't. Here I am reminded of a few tangible takeaways from both my week at Naropa University and the following month I spent reflecting on it. Granted, I'll eventually finish this essay and publish it, only to realize I've gained yet more. This is one thing that makes the written word so interesting. It's a materialization of consciousness, an eroticization of, an orgasm of thought energy. It's also one of the closest means of preserving a perception of time or space and motion, of what was up in someone's imagination at some point in the universe's, the multiverse's expansion. I feel my very purpose for writing has become remarkably clear for me. To be aware, conscious of, and record, as well as eroticize my thoughts. With my senses studying the facts on the ground, so to speak, while still peering at the invisible yet intuited stars of imagination, directing my thoughts in such a fashion that they draw constellations from these intuited stars. Constellations of some sense that's been made, how I think and feel and what I'm experiencing, mixed with some sense of that's been made what I pray to think and feel and what I pray to experience. And so now, when I listen to people or contemplate their self-expression, I feel more inclined to listen and wonder about what their expressions seem to suggest. What might they think and feel and pray for? What might they pray to think and feel and pray for? I shall try my best to presume as little as possible. Of course, we all make mistakes and we all gaffe, but we can still strive for better. I feel a new connection with people, humans, individuals who are individual and yet all interconnected. The first concrete material manifestation of this occurred that week in Boulder. I laughed with people for the first time in a long time, with the exception of some funny shows on Amazon Prime I watch with X, and more than I have in a long time. More than I have in a long time. I feel less lonely. I miss the people I met and had good conversations. To them, I'm thinking, until next time. And in the words of Barry Gibb from the Bee Gees song Immortality, written for Celine Dion, we don't say goodbye. At least not in certain dimensions of the imagination. And as I think about what this means for my love life and my sexuality, the erotic, I'm reminded of a beautiful remark written by Clara Zornado. So what's erotic? Clara asks. More specifically, what's erotic about an epistle? But adds, I think passivity in all communication is a turnoff, and that the least taunting, most intimate thing to do is ask for something because you'd love to have it. Read my letter, see if you want to write back. That's an invitation for you. Joe's response, a lack of the explicit is a turnoff for me. Say what you mean. Throw it out there and let it fall on me. That's my greatest fantasy. Someone telling me the truth. As some people say, word. So, if I'm not to be passive, if I'm to be explicit, if there's something I'd love to have and have it here and now, I've got to say what I mean. Ask for it, invite, feed someone's greatest fantasy, tell the truth. at least for now. That makes me want to write more essays about the erotic. That's what makes me want to call my essay collection and blog the Sapiosexual Erotophile. Well, in significant part, I have Naropa University to thank for that. For that and for helping me find my voice, tap into my thoughts and feelings and prayers, and appreciate the thoughts, feelings, and prayers of others. Namaste. Thank you so much.